As a dentist, not only was he looked up to, he was a figure of authority.
Whatever was going on, you could bet that Colin Howell would be there, either leading it or right at the very heart of it. She was a young woman who was looking for excitement.
A town like Coleraine, it's very hard to keep an affair like that a secret.
He thought he was extremely clever.
No one would have any reason to suspect anything other than suicide.
My name is Mandy Macaulay, and I'm an investigative journalist for the BBC. I'll never forget it. We were sitting in the office one afternoon. It was a very wet, dark January day, and a call came through to the newsroom. You could not have made this story up. It had everything. If you had set out to write an epic drama, it had sex, lust, Christianity, money, betrayal, deceit, and ultimately death. It just wrote itself.
I'm Peter Winter. I'm a reporter with the Coleraine Chronicle. It wasn't a typical case because most murders occur on the margins of society. This involved two very respectable middle-class families, church-going, God-fearing people who were well respected in the local area.
We just sat there in complete shock and disbelief. A very well-known, very high-profile dentist had just walked in to a police station in Coleraine and had confessed to murdering his first wife and also the husband of his former lover.
Colerane's a provincial town about 55 miles north of Belfast, quite close to the beautiful north coast of Northern Ireland.
It's dotted with, upmarket wine bars and restaurants, and I mean, really an absolutely stunning setting.
It's fairly close-knit. People know each other's business a lot of the time.
Everyone loved Colin Howell. Colin Howell was extremely charismatic, very chatty. He threw himself into everything. I remember someone saying to me, Colin Howell was the kind of guy that every mother wanted their daughter to marry because he was so successful, so charming, and he also was a committed Christian. Colin Howell grew up in Portadown in County Armagh. He went to Queen's University, where he was singled out very early on as a high flyer in the world of dentistry. He went into cosmetic implant dentistry. He was a man who was focused, I'm told, who knew what he wanted, and he wanted to be successful.
That's where he met his future wife, Leslie Clark, as she was then. She was a nurse at the local hospital in Belfast.
Leslie was a very natural beauty, very ethereal, very soft. People talk about her melodic voice, that she lit up a room.
At a fairly early stage before they were married, she got pregnant. Now, that must have been really tough for her as a religious person. Colin is very worried about the impact on him of having a baby out of wedlock before marriage, so he encouraged her to have an abortion.
An outsider looking in would have seen a very successful, very charming, very loved up couple. A couple who were going places. He was a youth leader in the local church, so whatever was going on, you could bet that Colin Howell would be there, either leading it or right at the very heart of it. Leslie was very, very popular among the other mothers and had lots of friends.
They moved from place to place, always socially, upwardly mobile, moving to bigger houses, better areas, and so on. My feeling is that a lot of this was for show, or because Colin was chasing status, as in putting themselves in financial peril by pushing beyond his means when they bought their latest house. A sense that he just felt that it was so important that he was admired, so important that he had social standing.
There was very much two sides to Colin Howell. There was the very charismatic Colin. He was also quite an arrogant man, but also very, very dark moods that would flicker to the surface every now and then. Hazel and Colin's affair began when they were both teachers in the Sunday school in Korean Baptist Church. Hazel was teaching young children there, and Colin was a youth leader. And quite literally, their eyes met across the room.
For a man like Colin, perhaps for him having a woman who desired him over and above his wife, if he's a narcissist, would have been important to him.
At that stage, Leslie was heavily pregnant with her youngest child. So while she was resting at home, Hazel and Colin were becoming closer, taking the children to the local swimming pool for lessons. And by the summer of 1990, they were caught up in a full-blown affair.
I don't think it's any coincidence that Colin's affair with Hazel began around about the same time that they were having money problems. For somebody like Colin, being in financial distress is going to be far more of a slur on his manhood, if you like, than it might be for other people. He believes himself to be superior to everybody else. He believes that he should be treated differently because he is better than everybody else. So having financial problems is going to have a huge impact on his self-esteem. It may well be that his affair with Hazel was part of getting over that, making himself feel better, making himself feel more of a man.
She met her future husband Trevor at a very early age, and the pair got married and moved to Coleraine, where Trevor, who was a policeman, had been posted. Trevor Buchanan was seen as a solid, dependable type who'd worked hard to get his dream job in the police.
Trevor was the very antithesis of Colin Howell. Colin Howell had to be in the centre of everything, whereas Trevor was a very funny guy, dedicated to his family, incredibly decent, and had lots of friends, and he was happy with that. I think that by her mid-20s, Hazel was growing very restless and very dissatisfied in her marriage. She had had her two children very quickly after the marriage, and I think that by the time she met Colin Howell, I have been told that she was a young woman who was looking for excitement, who felt that there was something missing from her life.
A town like Coleraine, it's very hard to keep an affair like that a secret. They would go to sort of local beauty spots, but there was always a risk that they'd be seen by somebody who knew them. Anyone who lives in a small town knows that the chances of bumping into someone you know are always pretty high.
What matters to Colin Howell is what other people think about him. And so long as that's pristine, so long as that is beyond criticism, he's happy. And so he will do things for appearance's sake.
During the course of his affair with Hazel, Colin persuaded her to have an abortion, exactly as he'd done with his wife before their marriage. And that speaks to this idea that he does not want to be found out, that outward appearance of him being the perfect family man, the perfect successful dentist, was more important to him than anything else.
I am Professor Donna Youngs. I am a professor of investigative psychology at Northumbria University. As a dentist, not only was he looked up to, he was a figure of authority, just compounding the sense of superiority, which I think was part of his personality.
She actually went to her church pastor in an extremely distressed state and said, look, there's something not right in my marriage. I think Colin's having an affair. And the pastor confronted Colin and he point blank denied it. But eventually Hazel did confess, and Leslie and Trevor were both told about what had been going on. Leslie was absolutely devastated, but determined to make her marriage work. And Trevor, also absolutely heartbroken, but he too wanted the marriage to continue.
The Baptist Church did their best to console the couples and try and put a stop to it.
The pastor was delighted. Colin and Hazel had sought forgiveness. Leslie and Trevor had forgiven them, and all four were moving on with their lives. But Colin and Hazel just could not keep away from each other, and they very quickly resumed the affair behind their partners' backs. At night, Colin would go running through Mount Sandal Forest, which backed onto Hazel and Trevor's house. And while Trevor was out on night duty as a police officer, Colin would go into Hazel's house and they would spend time together, and then he would leave in the early hours. At that time, he was drugging Leslie with red wine and with tablets so that she wouldn't realise just how much time he was spending away from the house in the early hours of the morning.
She was absolutely devastated by this. By all accounts, they had a very close relationship. It must have been a terribly difficult time for her, and therefore it's not really surprising that she did turn to alcohol and drugs.
At one stage, Leslie becomes so unhappy that she actually takes an overdose of tablets, and she's rushed to hospital, and she survives and is very remorseful, and she tells her friends that she could never leave her children and she will never do it again.
It seemed very much that this was a cry for help, but she did write a suicide note.
They began to think that night, well, what would have happened if Leslie had died? What would have happened if she hadn't come home from the hospital, if she hadn't survived the overdose? My life might have been so much better.
He told Hazel about it one night at a local beauty spot. He gave her 4 specific jobs to do, and that as long as she was able to do those jobs, then he hoped they would be in the clear.
I think it's so interesting that in advance of committing the murders, Colin tells Hazel that what he's planning to do. I think it tells us so much about the dynamic of their relationship, about how much he dominates the whole of the relationship, and doesn't question the fact that she will submit to that beyond every other source of authority. For her, his authority trumps the police, trumps the community, trumps the courts, it even trumps the church.
Leslie, in the early evening, was going in and out of consciousness on the sofa in the lounge. She had been drinking red wine. She had also taken some prescription drugs.
He gave her a sedative to ensure that she was asleep.
Colin, as a dentist, there's no question that he would have had access to drugs, including tranquilizers and including sleeping tablets.
Hoyle barricaded his children into their bedrooms, and once he knew that they were secure, he set about putting his murder plan in motion.
He went to his car, he attached a hose pipe from the exhaust of the car and ran it into the room where she was asleep.
Hoyle took his baby's feeding bottle and he cut the top off it, and he connected it to a hose. He put the nozzle of the baby's feeding bottle up to her mouth and started to gas her.
Carbon monoxide is a very effective way of killing people. You will, to begin with, feel generally unwell, feel drowsy, feel sick, feel headachy. But within a very short space of time, if you're exposed to a lot of carbon monoxide, you will become unconscious.
For most killers, there is a point when they have to look into the eyes of the person they are murdering. That's not something Colin Howell was able to do. He wanted to avoid judgment, even as he killed his wife. And I think there's a sense in which, if that murderous moment of encounter doesn't happen, I think in Colin Howell's mind, in some ways, the murder doesn't happen.
He carried Leslie to the car and put her in the boot, covered her with a blanket, gathered a few things, photographs, a tape recorder with a tape that had gospel music on it, and drove across town to Hazel's house, where Hazel was waiting for him.
This is one of the roads that Colin Hoyle travelled that night. It's hard to imagine what he must have been thinking. He had his wife's body dumped in the boot. He later said he was terrified that he would get stopped by police. And so he was driving very slowly.
When he arrived, he was annoyed that Hazel had not already opened the garage. That had been part of the plan. She had been standing at the window, but she hadn't had everything ready for him for his arrival.
When Hoyle arrived, Trevor was lying, drifting in and out of consciousness in his bedroom. Hazel was sent by Hoyle into a room where she hid while he turned on the ignition again of the car in the garage and again fed the hose pipe through to Trevor's bedroom. He held it up to Trevor's mouth and realised that Trevor wasn't asleep. he wasn't unconscious and that he was going to fight for his life, which Trevor did.
He jumped on the bed, took the hose and thrust it directly into Trevor's mouth. Now at that point, Trevor awoke and a struggle ensued. But he was in a drugged state and he was no match for Colin, who was fit and healthy as it was. And he was on top of him, astride him. He kept the hose in his mouth and waited until the body went lifeless.
We're talking about somebody who in his everyday life is used to controlling people and then doing things to them. And I think in his mind, this would just have been an extension of that.
Colin had given Hazel a series of orders. He told her to prepare clothes in which he could dress the body. And after he'd finished, he told her that she was to dispose of the hose pipe that had been used for the murder.
Presenting as a suicide is a cowardly approach to murder. It's a way of trying to set it up so that the blame can be passed from him, not just to avoid detection, but to set up a story that that's what's really happened.
At just after 3 a.m, Colin had left Hazel's house and he was driving along this road with not one but 2 bodies in the boot. Feels so strange being back here all these years later. I think it's only now that you realise just how stunning this little village is and how obscene it is that Colin Howell drove up this road with the bodies of his wife and his lover's husband in the boot. Such evil in a place that is just so tranquil.
He drove the car into the garage. He left Leslie in the boot and he moved Trevor to the front seat.
Trevor was quite tall, so Howell had quite a few problems getting him into the driver's seat, and he actually had to leave Trevor's leg or his knee wedged in the driver's seat door. This man was so arrogant that he even had a photograph of himself with Leslie in a beautiful silver frame placed beside her body. I mean, he really did think that he had staged and dressed the scene right down to the very last detail.
He placed headphones on her head and pressed play on a cassette player which contained a cassette with gospel music.
I think the complexity, the elaborateness of the plan is an indication of the way that he's not really admitting to himself that he's committing simple, straightforward murder.
He picked up his bike that he'd stashed on the hedge, and then he cycled back to Coleraine with literally only about 2 hours to spare until it was morning. His children were still barricaded in their bedrooms. He checked that they were okay. He burnt the clothes, he burnt the surgical gloves and the sheets. He rang Hazel to tell her that he had made it safely home. And then he set about his cover.
Colin calls the church elders. He says his wife is missing. So the elders of the church go looking. In due course, they discover the car with the bodies of Leslie and Trevor. There was an exhaust pipe, a pipe piping carbon monoxide into the car.
The police were called and they examined the scene, but to all intents and purposes, it looked like a suicide. The fact that the door of the car was still open with Trevor's leg hanging out of it, the fact that Leslie was in the boot of the car. Why would she be in the boot?
Trevor had blood on his sweatshirt. This just didn't seem to quite fit. Normally, if you have a couple who make a decision to commit suicide in a car using carbon monoxide, you'd expect them to have been sitting together, perhaps holding hands for comfort.
Colin had perhaps relied on the fact that a pathologist's report would undoubtedly find that the pair had been poisoned by carbon monoxide. Given the background to the case and the upset that his wife and his lover's husband were clearly going through.
Hazel tells police that the previous night she had been awakened from her sleep by noises from the kitchen. It had been Trevor and Leslie. They had sounded very distressed. It added to the narrative that Leslie and Trevor were together the previous night, but also that they were extremely distressed by the affair. Leslie had said, you know, I can't take any more, I'm going to sleep now, and if I wake up in the morning, let this be our secret. But in actual fact, the note that Colin had produced was one that Leslie had written months earlier, when she had discovered that her husband and Hazel were continuing their sexual relationship behind her back. I think that Colin Howell had a very high opinion of himself. He thought he was extremely clever, and yes, he thought that he was clever enough and smart enough to get away with the perfect murder.
Colin and Hazel both gave evidence, and they spoke of their unhappy marriages and how they'd met, had an affair, and were shocked at the fact that their spouses had taken their own lives.
There's no question that Leslie's death solved a lot of problems for Colin. Firstly, she was out of the way, as it were. This would allow him to continue his affair with Hazel. But in addition, there was some financial gain for him. He did have an insurance policy, which was a lot of money. It was about £400,000. And in addition, her father had only recently died, so she, of course, would have inherited money from her father, which, on her death, would have gone to her husband.
The affair continued for about 5 years after the deaths of their husband and wife.
Perhaps one of the greatest ironies is that it wasn't Colin who left Hazel. It was actually Hazel who left Colin. Hazel went on to marry a retired chief inspector in the police and had a very good, very affluent lifestyle for many years. Colin met an American divorcee. She had come to Northern Ireland from America, where she had fled an abusive relationship. She had 2 young children, and within 11 months they were married, and they went on to have 5 children. Using the money that he had made from Leslie's death, he went on to not only rescue his dental practice, but to forge a very, very successful international cosmetic dental practice. They would holiday around the world in the most luxurious spots, and by all accounts, Hoyle was living the high life.
He tells his new wife that he and Hazel murdered their respective partners and made it look like a suicide.
To me, it feels as if it's a slightly false confession, in that I think he is absolutely confident in his wife that it will not go beyond her. That means that he can offload this thing that has been worrying him.
This confession must have weighed incredibly heavily on her. Why he told her at that stage and then refused to allow her to tell anyone else, we don't know. Perhaps it was because he had no compassion towards her, and indeed he had no sense of the huge burden that it would place on her.
He'd invested in a crazy scheme to recover World War II gold that had been stashed in the Philippines by the Japanese, apparently. And unsurprisingly, he discovered that he'd been scammed, and he lost over £350,000.
Colin was convinced that God had punished him for what he did to Leslie and Trevor by killing his beloved oldest son, and that now that he had fallen out of favour with God, he felt that he had no other option but to confess to what he'd done and to hand himself in. Colin Hoyle was determined from the moment he walked into the police station in 2009 that he was going to implicate his former lover, and that if his life was going to come crashing down, then Hazel Stewart's life was going to come down too. The detail that he shared with police was eye-watering. He literally went through everything, every detail of the affair, the lead up to the murder, the cover-up, everything. This really was a man who, for some reason, wanted to unburden himself. Colin Hoyle wanted the world to know exactly who he was, what he was, and just how awful and heinous he'd been. He did not spare Hazel. Right from the get-go, he implicated her every step of the way. Police came to her home. They told her what she'd been accused of, and her world came crashing down. By pleading guilty, Hoyle ensured that Hazel would be the one who would have to stand in the dock and face the public wrath. Some people have said that Colin never recovered from Hazel rejecting him, and that in many ways this was his ultimate revenge.
The trial of Hazel Stewart was scheduled to last about 3 weeks.
This was the biggest and most sensational murder trial in Northern Ireland's history. I have never, either before or since, experienced anything like the anticipation and the drama that surrounded it.
Throughout Coleraine, there was a dark fascination over this case. People wanted to know as much as possible about what had happened.
I'm just standing yards from the road where Hazel lived at the time of the murders. The last time I stood in this spot, it was thronged with media, journalists. We were all trying to get a shot of Hazel and the children as he went to and from the court for the trial. It seems so strange now. It's so lovely and quiet and just a beautiful residential area.
That was a big moment in the trial. Everyone wanted to see this guy. He hadn't been in public since his arrest. He'd been remanded in custody and had gone straight to prison after his guilty plea. But here he was in Coleraine Courthouse with the nation's media upon him.
Colin painted a picture of Hazel as a woman who may have appeared as if butter didn't melt, but actually wasn't as innocent as she seemed. That was the message that he wanted to get across to the jury. And at every twist and every stage of his testimony, it was very much, she may not have been a willing participant, but she was right there every step of the way.
He came across as arrogant. He spoke about his knowledge of forensics, which he had learnt during his study of dentistry. He spoke about thinking meticulously about the plan and being sure that it would work. The defence strategy was to paint Howell as a super intelligent, manipulative and controlling person who had swept her along against her will to do things that she wouldn't otherwise have done.
I think Colin Howell was exposed for what he really was at that trial, and that was an extremely arrogant, self-centred showman, and I think the jury saw that quite clearly.
That was the week in which the jury heard the tapes of Hazel's police interviews. The police interviews were, in my opinion, a masterclass in interrogation.
You could have heard a pin drop in the courtroom whenever Hazel's tapes were played. Because I think up until that moment, a lot of people, women in particular, wanted to believe that Hazel was a victim, that Hazel was a woman who had been coerced, and that she wasn't a bad person. There is a very dramatic moment in the police interviews where she says, look, one night Colin said to me, Hazel, there is a way. And I said, what is it? And he said, well, we could kill them. And she said, oh, I was terrified. But it was at that moment that it was very obvious that Hazel knew that Colin was intending to kill both Leslie and Trevor.
Detective Sergeant Jeff Ferris conducted most of the interviews, and he was able to draw out confessions that she knew of the plot, that she'd sedated her husband, that she knew Howell was coming, that she opened the door to him, that she knew Leslie was dead in the boot, and that she'd provided clothes and that she'd destroyed evidence. She'd burnt the hose that had been used to poison both her husband and his wife.
And I think when people heard the confession, heard that she knew what Colin was about to do, and that she had not made any attempt to save either Leslie or Trevor, I think they were really stunned, and a lot of people recoiled from them. It was just unbelievable to listen to them in court. And there was Hazel, sitting silently in the dock, just looking straight ahead of her.
One of the last admissions that Jeff Ferris was able to draw out of her was that she could have stopped the plot from happening. She told him that I could have stopped it. I could have stopped it. She repeated it twice. The judge had asked the jury to determine whether Hazel and Howell were in this together.
Hazel had tried to convince the jury that she was also a victim of Colin Howell. They didn't believe her.
The judge said that she had shown very little remorse. In fact, he said that the only remorse she'd shown was about the fact that she'd been caught. The judge was clear that of the two, Howell was the primary plotter. It had been his idea. He'd actually committed the murders himself. Hazel was not quite as culpable, but at the same time, she had done nothing to stop what had happened and had assisted Howell. It couldn't have happened without her.
Hazel just looked completely stunned, bewildered, motionless. And sitting just across from her, I'll never forget her children, her daughter, absolutely devastating, crying out in disbelief. Because even then, they believed that their mother was innocent.
To suffer the death of a mother or a father as a child is probably among the worst things that can happen to someone. To then discover that it was your father or mother who killed them is unimaginable.
The impact statements from the Buchanan family were absolutely devastating. And for the family, finding out that Trevor had been murdered, they said was like losing him all over again. And the only comfort that they and Leslie's children had was that they finally had relief, knowing that their loved ones had not deliberately left them. It's hard to put into words just how devastating this was for the evangelical, tight-knit Christian community in Coleraine. Many of these people who were taken in by Howell were the real McCoy. They had spent their lives dedicated to good works. And this guy took advantage of them, and the fallout has been absolutely devastating to this day.
Could he have got away with it? He had got away with it. He'd got away with it for 20 years. Hazel wasn't going to say anything. Nobody would have known the truth unless he had confessed.
All of the main players in this tragedy were people who on the surface looked as if they had it all. And yet, behind the scenes, as the trial exposed, they were no better than any of us.